We think differently.
Hello, good morning to everyone, or good afternoon for our participants from Asia. It's my great pleasure to close this year's session of Geneva Talks on geoeconomics and geopolitics with a special guest. But first and most of all, on behalf of the faculty members of the Swiss UMEF University of Geneva and other campuses, and especially in the name of the president of UMEF, Dr. Javed Sandel, and other members and the students, I want to welcome our today's guest, who is the former president of Republic of Austria, of the Second Republic of Austria. And although the official biography has been distributed to you, I will just go quickly on the couple of most important parts of the biography. Dr. Heinz Fischer was born in Graz in Styria shortly before the Second World War. And this is the southeastern part, very lovely part of Austria, of today's Austria. He studied law, so legal science and legal studies in University of Vienna in so-called Juridicum. And he was earning the doctorate by 61. So what is interesting also for us as a university fellows, besides being a politician, Dr. Fischer was very successful. Was not that much in the career, but was very successful as a teacher, as a professor, and he was teaching political science at University of Innsbruck, which is the western part, closer to Switzerland, part of Austria, in the lovely city of Innsbruck. So he was remembered and he marked the decades of being in the Austrian parliament for practically over 30 years. He was joining Austrian National Parliament, Federal Parliament of Austria by 71, and he stayed there shortly up to the moment when he was running for the presidency. So it was 2002, and basically let's say the second part of this period in the parliament, he was actually the majority leader, to say it in the American English way. So he was the first president of the parliament, as he was actually representing for the most of that period the most let's say present political party, which was the Social Democratic Party of Austria. He was also for the period, he was a Minister of Science, which is also important for us as university fellows. From 83 to 87, he was in the government. It was a coalition government after the legendary Chancellor Bruno Kreisky has stepped down. So it was, if I'm not mistaken, was a coalition with that time liberals, and it was the government of Fred Sinowatz and the beginning of the also very successful government of Franz Vranitzky. So for that period of time, for some 4 or 5 years, future president at that time, future President Fischer was a Minister of Science. And then he was succeeding Thomas Kleistel by 2004, and was actually managing also to get the second term because the approval ratings were very high. And if I'm not mistaken, the second run of the President Fischer for the presidency was even more successful than the first run, which was having some 55% of the votes. And before I open the floor and give the floor to President Fischer, let me just close shortly with a more personal note. I met President Fischer for the first time in early 90s in Renner Institute. It was Eric Froschel there and Liesl Kauer. And we've been at that time concepting one project, one let's say process related to Eastern Europe, and then I was actually witnessing firsthand that President Fischer was brilliant then, as he's brilliant even today. So President Fischer, we are very happy. And yeah, of course, not to forget President Fischer, after closing successfully his second term, joined Ban Ki-moon Center, and he's running very important center, which is enhancing understanding and promotion of dialogue and peace and stability all over the world. And he, of course, personally was befriended with the Excellency Ban Ki-moon. For you who don't know, Ban Ki-moon was serving as ambassador of South Korea, or Republic of Korea, which is the official name of South Korea. He was serving in Vienna, and he got the call at that time, and he returned from Austria basically and became a foreign minister. And after that, he was selected, nominated actually to be the next Secretary General of United Nations. So he remembered Vienna very well. And what is interesting for Vienna is actually, of course, Vienna remains a very important diplomatic center for Europeans, but for non-Europeans, Vienna, and of course for the fact that it has a seat of Organization for Security and Cooperation, which is the most comprehensive multilateral mechanism for security matters after the United Nations, but it gathers more or less only Europe. What is interesting for non-Europeans is actually the UN, and especially for those countries that are having nuclear issues, as it is Korea, Japan, and others. So they send very, very, let's say, prominent diplomats to be presented in Vienna for the fact to, not only for the bilateral relations, but also for the fact of being presented in the UN. Because, as you know, after Geneva and New York, actually the third principal seat of United Nations is Vienna, which is also the legacy, I must say at this point, which is the legacy of the Chancellor Kreisky, who was a visionary man who invited OPEC to come, and also who was very prominent and very, let's say, active in gaining actually a seat of United Nations. So President Fischer, without further ado, thank you once more for joining us this morning, and the floor is yours, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Professor Bakterjevich, for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, thank you also for the invitation to contribute to the Swiss UMEF University with my observation to the question, has the European integration process reached a dead end? When dealing with history, as for instance with the development of European integration, one of the most important and most interesting topics for me is the question whether human beings learn from history. Some say yes, and some say no. And the Austrian writer Ingeborg Bachmann said, I quote, "History teaches, but it doesn't find pupils." And I want to say that I'm less pessimistic than Ingeborg Bachmann, because I'm convinced that we indeed learn a lot from history. Otherwise, the process of European integration after World War II would not have been possible. It was the consequence of an important and dramatic lesson from history. But I'm afraid that after one or two generations, the lessons of history start to fade away and get lost again. This we must keep in mind in order to avoid a dead end for the European integration. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, World War II was a shock, an absolute shock. More than 50 million people were killed worldwide, including 6 million victims due to the Holocaust. Millions of refugees and millions of handicapped people. Many cities and their infrastructures were destroyed from warfare and bombardment. The balance of power in Europe and in world politics changed dramatically after Germany was defeated and two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. A few years later, Mao's China forcefully appeared on the map of history. I myself, as it was mentioned already, was born in 1938, 1 year before World War II began. I started going to school in 1944, and I remember very well the hooting of sirens once bomber planes were approaching Vienna again and again. We had to immediately rush to the air raid shelter, and you could feel the shock and the shaking of bombs hitting neighboring houses. I remember some months later a Soviet T-34 tank crushing the garden fence in front of our house like matches and standing in the garden as a frightening monster. Soviet soldiers came out of the tank, panic at home. But they were not aggressive or doing any harm. They occupied and confiscated the ground floor of the house where we lived in order to establish a printery for printing posters and leaflets for the Red Army. And I remember that we got at school some weeks or months later food in care parcels from the US Army. And this was very important food. Apart from my personal memories, it's a fact that Spring 45 was a crucial period in the life of my family, in the history of Austria, which was reborn and reconstructed as an independent state in April 45, and the history of Europe and even worldwide. Hitler committed suicide on April the 30th, 1945, and the mad and brutal Nazi regime, which was based on extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, and the totalitarian Führerprinzip, was crashed and defeated. Nazi Germany capitulated on May 8, 1945. But what to do next? How to rebuild Germany? How to rebuild Europe? How to establish and protect peace? How to overcome and avoid the continuation of nationalism, hostility, and reprisal? How to avoid the mistakes that had been made after World War I and contributed to the fateful development in the following years? Dear colleagues, the way from war to peace is always very difficult, much more difficult than the way from peace to war. And many different ideas about post-war Europe were developed, tabled, and discussed. Different interests constituted the basis for different proposals. But after more than 50 million victims, peace had a very high value and was a great priority, almost worldwide. And so it was possible to reach agreement and pave the way for the foundation of the United Nations as early as 1945 and for the Human Rights Declaration in 1948. In my eyes, a great success and a good beginning after the war. And in Western Europe, support for the idea of bringing the enemies from yesterday together gathered in the idea of a common Europe of tomorrow. And there we are on our subject. Winston Churchill, Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet, Boris Bach, Alcide de Gasperi, and others, as you know, were more and more supporting the idea of a united democratic Europe. Economic and political cooperation between France, Germany, Italy, and other European countries was the best way to retain and reduce nationalistic egoism and link the economies in a way that war, hopefully, cannot be an option to solve problems in Europe anymore, as it happened so many times before in European history. But at the same time, the tension and antagonism between Stalin and his empire on the one side and the Western world on the other side was growing. It was an antagonism between different ideologies and the fight for dominance in the world after 1945. 45, yes. The expression of Cold War was used in the United States administration as early as 1946 already. And in the same year, 46, United States Foreign Secretary James Burns gave a speech of hope, as he called it, in the German city Stuttgart, saying that the United States government wants the German people, das deutsche Volk, to take the responsibility for the development in their country and for good cooperation with other democracies. This was addressed particularly to the western part of Germany, while eastern part under Soviet occupation was forced to go a totally other direction. The next important step was the announcement of the so-called Marshall Plan for Europe, which was originally designed for the whole of Europe, but rejected by countries under Soviet dominance. Austria's government was in a difficult situation because the eastern part of Austria was in that time in the Soviet occupation zone. And nevertheless, Austria joined the Marshall Plan under heavy critique from the Communist Party and Soviet officials. The Cold War became colder and colder and reached a first peak with the blockade of Berlin in 1948 and the foundation of NATO in 1949. As a consequence, the notion of Western European integration became stronger and stronger. In April 1951, the European Community for Coal and Steel, Montanunion, was founded between 6 countries, including Germany and France, and signed in Paris. One can very well say that it was the moment when the European idea started to become a European reality. At that moment, Europe was already clearly divided in an Eastern and a Western hemisphere, with some exceptions like Switzerland, Austria, Sweden, Finland, etc. In March, beginning of March 1953, Joseph Stalin died. And the fight for his succession was murderous. Finally, Nikita Khrushchev won the power struggle and became #1 in a more collective leadership in the Kremlin. And his most dangerous rival, Lavrenti Beria, chief of the security policy, was executed. After almost 30 years of Stalin's dominance and the terror in the Soviet Union, Stalin was ruling from 1924 to 1953. A new era with a more collective leadership started. We in Austria, we are convinced that the death of Stalin was an important element for successful negotiations about the Austrian State Treaty in April and May 1955, because the new leaders in Moscow wanted to demonstrate that they are ready for substantial negotiations and ready for compromises. 2 years later, the Treaty of Rome was signed in March 1957, creating the European Economic Community, EEC, between 6 member countries, as we all know. This is now more than 60 years ago, but it marked the beginning of a new level of political integration, which is now, in my opinion, in a rather difficult period, as the title of this presentation indicates. Dear colleagues, at the beginning of the 60s, the European Economic Community was an area with roughly 200 million inhabitants, while Europe as a whole had about 700 million inhabitants, which means that only 30% of the European population was at the beginning united in the EEC. But these 6 countries were like-minded democracies, neighboring countries with growing political and economic influence and good preconditions for political and economic cooperation. Decision-making in this group of 6 was much, much more easier than decision-making in the European Union of today. The EEC was successful and attractive, and so the enlargement process got its dynamic. In 1973, Great Britain, Ireland, and Denmark joined the EEC. In the 80s, the development continued with the so-called Southern Enlargement, Greece, Spain, and Portugal. It was the time when Helmut Kohl, German Bundeskanzler, described the United States of Europe as his long-term goal. And it is for me remarkable that none of the heads of states and governments from today ever uses this wording. During the 10 years period of Jacques Delors as president of the Commission, mid-80s till mid-90s, we experienced the next important step, namely the step from the EEC to the European Union. It was the basis for a better coordinated foreign policy, a precondition for the introduction of the euro currency for those countries who wanted to join the monetary union, and it was strengthening the role of the European Parliament. In this period, it was, as I've said already, very attractive to join the European Union, as the Union formulated strict conditions and admissions procedures for membership in the club. Then came the miraculous year 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain in Europe. In these days, 3 other countries, originally 4 other countries, democratic countries with good economic performance, namely Austria, Finland, and Sweden, and in addition Norway, applied for membership, and 3 of them became EU members on the 1st January 1995. Norway made a referendum and it was negative, and I remember by chance I was meeting Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland on the day after the referendum, and I saw her weeping heavily because Norway didn't pass the referendum. In 2004 came the big jump ahead, the enlargement from 15 to 25, and soon after to 27 and even 28 members. It was almost the reunion of the European continent, with several exceptions for different reasons. In my memory, these years were the best moments in the European integration process. But it was also, to a certain extent, a turning point. The number of diverging interests was enlarging, not only the number of countries, and it was growing parallel to the number of members of the Union. The European Union became more and more the voice of Europe, but there was more and more often no consensus about the text for the voice. The new member countries of the Eastern enlargement were in the beginning united in their pro-European, anti-communist and anti-Russian feelings. However, in other fields of politics, they were more and more often not united with each other and not united with the rest of Europe. The question is, what was the reason for that development? One of the observations I have made is the following. During many of my visits to the so-called new democracies in the 90s of the last century, and at the beginning of this century, I observed that their national identity of these countries under Soviet dominance had been brutally suppressed during the Soviet supremacy And their so-called internationalism or international brotherhood was not a genuine development. It had been enforced. And soon after the collapse of European communism and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, these countries showed that they were fed up with internationalism, even European internationalism, and nationalism saw a powerful renaissance. With this background, populistic nationalism in some countries, and not only Eastern European countries, became step by step stronger than European thinking and European solidarity. Today, frontrunners in this respect seem to be Poland and Hungary, but they are not the only ones. And we shall see whether today or in the next days the contradictions about regulations from Brussels to connect financial support with protecting the values, the basic values of the European Union can be breached and a fruitful result can be reached. It's not by chance that from these countries, Brussels is sometimes compared with Moscow in earlier times. We didn't like the dominance of Moscow and we don't like the dominance of Brussels, although in my opinion, it's totally wrong to compare these two symbols for dominance. Okay, while growing nationalism is one big obstacle for the European cooperation and integration, the necessity of consensus in the constitution of the European Union in many fields of European policy is another big problem. Consensus is indeed recommendable, and consensus probably is necessary for some very far-reaching decisions with long-time consequences. But too many necessities for consensus are, in my opinion, poison for a coherent European policy. The more consensus is necessary, the bigger is the role of national interests. And the bigger the role of national interests is, the more we have a union with somehow injured wings, the more it is difficult to compete with the other big powers in the world. Let me now, distinguished guests and friends, let me now turn to some areas of present European policy. Since decades, we can observe the new developments, dimensions, and challenges of ecological and environmental policy. The figures of climate change and global warming speak a very clear language. On global level, and of course also in Europe, we have a lot to do in these fields. The Paris Climate Agreement from December 2015 set the goal of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, but the question remains whether we will reach this goal and whether this will be enough to prevent further biodiversity losses, glacier melting, intensified weather conditions, etc. It is, however, evident, and in my opinion, very positive, that the European Union is more and more trying to promote climate-friendly policies, in particular now under the leadership of Commission President von der Leyen. In her rather optimistic State of the Union address from September 16th this year, von der Leyen said, I quote, "I want the next generation EU to kickstart a European renovation wave and make our union a leader in the circular economy. A world served by an economy that cuts emissions, boosts competitiveness, reduces energy poverty, creates rewarding jobs, and improves quality of life." Quotation end. And it seems to me that the EU Commission is indeed trying quite hard, very hard, to reach progress and to mobilize the member countries on this field. They know that this must be a priority. Former French President of Parliament Fabius had said yesterday very rightly, against the problems with our climate, no vaccination will come and help. We need more than a vaccine to overcome this problem. And it should also be mentioned that as far as I can observe in the last couple of years, China took more and more the lead in green and renewable energy, whereas the Trump administration withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. But President-elect Joe Biden promised to re-enter the Paris Accord and step up its efforts against climate change. This, together with the approach of the European Commission, as I have described it, opens in my mind at least some room for careful optimism. Dear colleagues, the topic of migration, asylum and refugees is particularly near to my political feelings and must be mentioned and must be addressed in this presentation, and it has to be addressed in a less positive note. Refugees and migrants are part of history since states and borders exist. At the moment, we count more than 79 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, with more than 1/3 of them being children. We know that this is a huge global problem which the European Union cannot solve alone, and which nobody is expecting the European Union to solve it on its own. The Union and its member countries should be ready to contribute to a solution and to do their homework within the borders of the European Union and outside as well. But there is too much silence and not enough responsibility and action. What are the figures telling us? Very shortly. In the year 2014, 627,000 refugees were asking for asylum on the outside border of the European Union. In 2015, this number was increasing rapidly to 1,320,000 asylum seekers, and this caused a lot of problems, troubles, hostilities, and a wave of populism and nationalism. Last year, the figures were down to 720,000 asylum seekers in Europe again. But the words refugees, migration, or asylum, etc., seem to remain a taboo, and factual discussions are almost impossible. We must join efforts to search for European solutions to organize a fair distribution in Europe and provide necessary funding. One cannot let the problem fall down like a hot potato. We must find a solution for a fair distribution of refugees. Observing the policies in some European countries, and Austria is not an exception, I realize that the problem is not so much whether some governments can solve the issue, but the problem is whether they want to solve or rather use for populistic language and actions. In my opinion, it was more than disappointing and deplorable how negative some European countries reacted when Germany, France, Luxembourg, and some other EU member states recently proposed to take at least as a symbol a group of children out of their totally unacceptable situation in the devastated and inhumane refugee camp in Moria in Greece. This proposal was almost automatically rejected by many countries, and there is no chance, in my opinion, in the near future to find solutions for that. But on the long run, a future must come because the present situation is unacceptable. Dear colleagues, while we are fully occupied with migration problems, budgetary questions, Brexit, which is just now in a very interesting moment, and other dossiers, the COVID-19 pandemic was interrupting all our activities. In spring 2020, the overall economic and social situation in the European Union was fast deteriorating. Our eyes were opened to the European Union's fragility and vulnerability. And those who have been complaining for years about the European Union's excessive powers and concentration of power suddenly noticed and complained that in the areas of public health, the Union possesses only relatively few competences, and each member state has its own national health policy. But it was clear that we could only overcome this crisis on a basis of cooperation and solidarity. While last summer has seen a better development, a second wave in the past weeks has counted higher numbers than ever. In the meantime, we have managed to put in place some coordination at European Union level to fight jointly the virus. And the Commission has made useful proposals in some areas, such as cross-border commuting, transport of goods, external borders, purchase and distribution of vaccines, and international coordination of comparable statistics. And the strategic introduction of the next generation of EU recovery instrument amounting to 750 billion euros, which is linked to the next financial framework and the European Union budget for the years 2021 until 2027, is of crucial importance in managing the economic consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. The European Commission will be able, and this is an important development, to borrow money from the international markets on behalf of the 27 states to invest in economic recovery. This is a historic step, and the European Union also adopted new regulations where the allocation of EU funds to member states is tied to the provision of rule of law, what I find justified. This is posing a controversy with countries such as Hungary and Poland, and it symbolizes again grave national differences within the European Union when the request for a fair jurisdiction, rule of law and democracy are understood as provocation from one or the other European member state. I think there is also some movement in this question at the moment, and if today the European leaders meet in Brussels, there are informations that this problem could be solved, and I would be very happy if a reasonable result can be the outcome of this meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, if we look beyond the borders of the European Union, a very encouraging fact, in my opinion, is the result of the American presidential elections. With all respect, in my opinion, President Trump more and more was really I cannot say it another way, was really a danger for peace and international cooperation. He was and still is an opponent of multilateralism. He neglected the United Nations and other international organizations, and he was and is absolutely unpredictable. this is by far not helpful for long-term peaceful and stable global developments. Let us hope that President-elect Joe Biden will write a new chapter in United States policy, will overcome the split in the United States population, and will be a reliable leader in the Western world. It would be of utmost importance also in particular for Europe. And Europe has also hopes and wishes vis-à-vis China as a great nation. China became a superpower near the end of the 20th century, and it will not take long until they are number one worldwide as far as economic power is concerned. Some people in Europe and elsewhere are shocked with that perspective. But if I look at the history of China, and they are striving for stability, stability is a great value for them, then my conclusion is that even an economically growing and powerful China can and hopefully will be a reliable and predictable factor in international relations. After the China-European Union summit a few months ago, President von der Leyen said, in my opinion rightly, that the relations between the European Union and China are one of the most important and most challenging, and we have many common interests. That is true, and I add that the same can be said from the China side vis-à-vis Europe, common interests. The logical consequence would be to work on a reasonable balance between Chinese and European interests. And I think this should not be out of reach. During the Cold War, ladies and gentlemen, until about 30 years ago, the most powerful rival of the Western world was the Soviet Union and her allies. Many things have changed in the meantime, as I have mentioned before. But for the European Union, neighboring Russia is still a very important factor and rival and partner. Stable relations between Europe and Russia were always, in history, a contribution to security on both sides. And this is still relevant and should be a guideline, even if Russian politics of today is less constructive or trust-making as it was, obviously, in the time of Gorbachev, a special area in Russian policy until the beginning of the Putin era. But it may be that the unilateral expansion of NATO, for instance, right until the border of Russia, has contributed to the development, namely the development of bigger tensions between Russia and Europe. Therefore, we should look at the relations between the European Union and Russia, not only from the European perspective, but should have in mind also the perspective from the other side. Usually, dear colleagues, the importance and political influence of a country, and in particular of a powerful country or a group of countries, is primarily analyzed on the basis of its economic performance, but the military potential is also taken into consideration. In this respect, the European Union, with a military budget of $230 billion in 2019, still including Great Britain at that time, amounts to only 30% of the United States military budget, which reaches $732 billion, and is also lagging behind China with $260 billion in 2019, according to the figures of the Swedish SIPRI Institute. Next year, the Brexit will cause a cut of $48 billion British military expenditure from the European defense budget. With Great Britain, also one of the two European nuclear powers, and with a permanent seat in the Security Council of the United Nations, is leaving the European Union. But Great Britain will remain in NATO and therefore also remain part of the European Defence Forces in a wider sense. Therefore, in my opinion, the economic consequences of the Brexit for Europe are more worrying than the military consequences. And I believe that the future and strengths of the European Union will and should mainly be built upon fields like education and research and technologies and social balance and increased coherence, etc., than on arms expenditure. Dear colleagues, many discussions in the European Parliament are addressed to the level and quality of democracy in the European Union. And I would even say that the acceptance of the European Union is inter alia closely connected with the quality of democracy in Europe. And in this field, we have some unsolved problems. Yes, it's true, we have a directly elected European Parliament. Yes, we have a European Court of Justice. Yes, we have a Human Rights Convention, and we strictly keep the rule that only democracies can become member states of the European Union, and that rule of law is a crucial element of the European Union. Nevertheless, it is not easy to convince European citizens or a great number of European citizens that the quality that European democracy is already satisfying. Even in our democracies on a national level, we know the differences between the text of our constitutions and the level of democratic practices in daily political life. The European Parliament, in my opinion, is doing a very good job, but European democracy as a whole is not much more than the sum of national democracies and has not enough European dimension. Additionally, it is a fact that the most important decision makers in the European Union, namely the heads of states and governments in the European Council, feel primarily responsible to the national states where they come from and where they are elected, and much less responsible for Europe as a whole. If they get enough votes at home, it is enough to exert their powers and influence in the name of their home country on the European level. They do not need to convince voters in other European countries than in their own. The consequence is that connections to their national interests are much stronger than their connection to European interests. In Brussels, they are lobbying much more for national interests than in their national parliaments for European interests. Carefully shifting power from the European Council to the European Commission or other European institutions could eventually help to reach a better balance between national and European interests. Ladies and gentlemen, let me come back to the title of this lecture, namely whether the European integration process is in a dead end, which means with reduced chances for further development on the way to United States of Europe, or at least to a European Union that can combine further enlargement with further deepening. The answer to this question has to do with how much the European Union as a whole is accepted in its member states and how popular the European Union is. And it was very popular in the period of its beginning. When Austria joined the European Union in 1995, we had to make a referendum according to our constitution asking Austrian citizens whether or not their country, Austria, should join the Union. The outcome of this referendum in 1994 was 2/3 yes and 1/3 no. We were all very happy about this majority because Norway, as I've said already, did not reach the majority in the referendum and had to refrain from entering the European Union. On the other hand, I was hoping that after some years of membership and experience with European cooperation and lasting peace, etc., the amount of people who says yes to the European Union will increase, and the amount of people who voted against or vote against will go down. But this is not the case, at least not in Austria and some neighboring countries. If you ask the same question to the Austrian people today, one generation later, according to the Eurobarometer from summer 2020, you get quite similar results than 25 years ago. Another question that the Eurobarometer survey posed was whether the EU citizens have trust in European institutions. 43% noted to trust the European institutions in summer 2020, and 48% tend not to trust in them. This is quite poor and disappointing. It has probably many reasons. It's connected with the imperfect democracy on European level, but also with growing nationalism and the tendency of European leaders to attribute positive European developments to their national success and blame the European Union for negative developments. A former president of the European Parliament from 1994 until 1997, my good German friend Klaus Hensch, expressed this phenomenon in a wonderful little German poem, reading as following, I quote, Wenn bei uns die Sonne lacht, haben wir das selbst gemacht. Gibt es aber Eis und Schnee, war es die böse EWG. In English, if the sun is bright shining at home, then we have achieved it. But if there is ice and snow, Brussels is responsible for it. This seems to be a crucial element of our problems. In this context, I'm happy and satisfied that President von der Leyen announced in her inauguration speech a conference on the future of Europe. It should find new answers for the future of European democracy in order to prepare the next steps for further integration. The improvement of decision-making, the reform of institutions, and the strengthening of social and economic coherence will also be topics of this conference for the future of European democracy, 17 years after the last European Convention. The COVID-19 virus has delayed the beginning for this conference, but I think it still has and has even more high, very high priority. Dear colleagues, let me try to sum up. There is no doubt, in my opinion, that the European project was and still is very successful. The main goal, namely a peaceful Europe, was reached, even if we do not forget the short but tragic war in former Yugoslavia in the immediate neighborhood of the former European Union. Today, these parts are already integrated. Political stability and economic success have also been reached to a high degree. Democracy, as I just have mentioned, is by far not perfect on European level, but it is prevailing in most European countries. And Europe managed to be the continent with the highest quality of life if I take into consideration living standards, environmental performance, security, the role of culture, etc. But we must not only look at these important achievements until now. It is a fact that the European dynamic loses momentum. Decision-making on the basis of 27 or even more in case of enlargement member countries is becoming more and more difficult. Increasing nationalism, as I mentioned, as I mentioned several times, is a growing problem. And the fact that some member states in the European Union call themselves illiberal democracy, and they are indeed illiberal, is another warning lamp. European integration, in my mind, is not in a dead end, but it needs new energy, new inspirations, more coherence, and a tough position against nationalism and a strong will to defend European values. Otherwise, the vision of United States of Europe remains for many years to come an unfulfilled vision. And those who say that human beings do not learn from history have another example for their interpretation of history if we do not take care that the European Union gets a new strong impetus. And the basis for such an impetus is existing. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I stayed in the frame of the time I got for this presentation. Thank you very much.
Excellency, thank you. Excellency, thank you so much. It was brilliant, and really it was a span of 75 years, and it's really value-taking, brilliant. We already have a signal for many questions, and I'm sure that our participants and the viewers are very keen to engage in dialogue with you. But before I open the floor, just to sum up. So basically what we have in 75 years and what is the miracle of Europe was, of course, the strong basis on anti-fascism and the strategic reapproachment between France and Germany. Some sort of the truce and reconciliation that was basically a peace project that brought prosperity. But the third segment, which would be relevant also for your previous work, it relates to social democracy that has been, in the classical sense, a bit put to the margins. So, and it comes to the social contract, to the contract in society between economy that understands that society has its own needs and the society which also understands that the economy has its own needs. And especially because many are considering Austria and the Nordic countries as the supermodel to copy. But just a little take on the tripartite system that has built the Europe the Europe of prosperity, of stability, of peace, of no violence and crime on streets, or no homeless people. So practically just a short take on this, let's say, social consensus, which of course after pandemic times becomes again very much relevant. Which kind of societal compact and let's say model we should be taking on?
Do you want me to answer immediately, or do you ask for other questions now?
Just to give time to people to prepare for the question. Just if you can just have a brief take on that.
Well,
because on tripartite system and this, let's say, social cohesion that has been built.
When I was studying the European idea was an idea in all political groups of the Students' Union. We had the Social Democratic students, the Christian Democratic students, the Freiheitliche nationalistic students, some far left extremists also. But the European idea was the overarching future model. And it was interesting that even the national party in Austria, the FPÖ, the Freiheitliche Partei, was the most ardent supporter of the European idea. And against this background, as a young parliamentarian, when I was elected in parliament in the beginning of the 70s, it was the time of Willy Brandt and Bruno Kreisky and Olof Palme, and a little bit later, Felipe González in Spain, etc., etc. And in my lifetime, this was the era which I appreciate most and where I felt most at home in national and international policy. And of course, peace, social justice, security, democracy were the leading values. And these values, in my opinion, as I tried to describe, came as a result from the terrible experiences of war. Willy Brandt was an emigrant. Bruno Kreisky was an emigrant. Felipe González came out of the Franco dictatorship. This was a spring in European policy, but like a stone, if you throw the stone, it goes up to a certain time and then it falls down again to earth because gravity is bringing it down. And the energy of the European idea is still existing, but the gravity, I don't know the English word correctly, is bringing it down again. At least I see this danger. And I hope that a new generation of young people confronted with our present problems in the European integration process, how difficult the enlargement and to start negotiations enlargement, and how difficult the decision making is, that they can bring a new impetus to the new idea, so that at the end we really can come nearer to United States of Europe. This was my ideal 40 years ago, and I still would hope that the next generation can bring progress in that direction, but I'm not sure.
Thank you, Excellencies. Thank you, Excellencies, so much. We have really plenty of questions, at least what I see, but I'm sure that they are far more than, than I can see. So maybe, because Asians are already in the afternoon, late afternoon, so maybe we can just go to China. I think we have one of our colleagues that is in China that wanted to put the question. So Maria, I think you are there, or you can hear us.
Yes. Hello?
Please.
Can you hear me? Right. Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to say...
It's evening in China. It's evening already.
Yeah, it's almost actually 8, but yeah.
So you are in Wuhan, correct?
No, I'm in Shanghai.
In Shanghai,
right.
Okay, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the floor. So first of all, I want to say good afternoon to you. And let me thank you for your insightful speech. And it's really an honor to me to speak today and actually ask you questions. My name is Maria Smitritska. I'm from Ukrainian Association of Sinologists, and currently I live in Shanghai. So I have a lot of questions to ask, but I choose only one, the main. My question is mainly concerned related to geopolitics and the role of Central Eastern Europe, which the region can play in the development of the relations between Western Europe and Far East. We know that right now a big amount of new transshipment lines from Far East to West Europe are under construction, and Central East European region is playing a significant role in this process. But we also know that European Union itself isn't really happy about this process, and mainly emphasizing concerns about debt diplomacy of Asian partners and the lack of environmentally friendly standards. So the question is, in your opinion, what do you think Central East Europe can still play the dominant role in somehow like geopolitical bridge between Far East and Western Europe, and thus can cooperate with both sides of the dialogue, or it should rather choose only one side, underlining that sitting on two chairs right now in the current geopolitical game is rather very dangerous and it's almost impossible. And at the end of the day, each side has to choose only one side to support. What do you think? Whether she can be a link, or it better need to choose specific side of cooperation? Thank you.
Whether Ukraine can be a link between Far East and Europe?
It's very difficult to judge because of Ukraine, but you can tell me, because right now in Ukraine it's a difficult situation with crisis and economy, and it's really difficult to tell whether Ukraine can be in this link. I think most likely it will be Central and Eastern Europe, such countries as Poland, Hungary, Austria, maybe Greece, Belarus, but we know the situation in Belarus with Lukashenko as well. It's very unstable to judge. So I was thinking about your opinion. Can you?
Well, I have been several times in Ukraine, and I remember a state visit from the former and heavily criticized Ukraine President Yanukovych,
right.
where he explained me why Ukraine cannot connect too close to Europe, and why he was enforced to make a policy taking care on interests of Russia in a sufficient way. I believe, from my point of view, that the 21st century, Ukraine is in a situation that good relations and reasonable relations to Europe are in any case an advantage for Ukraine, and this should be a crucial element of Ukraine's international policy. But the second point is, if it's psychologically possible after all what happened, also to have reasonable and somehow trustful relations to Russia. Otherwise, Russia will see in Ukraine an enemy or a hostile country. So in the world of today, Ukraine can combine reasonable relations and good relations to Europe with stable relations to Russia, if that is possible, to enforce in the population. And the Far East is less a political question, is more an economic question, how you define your relations to China, which is interested on as much partnership as possible in Europe and in the neighborhood of Europe. This would be my approach, and the fact that Austria is a neutral country has probably some influence on this position of a balanced situation of Ukraine between Western Europe or European Union and Russia, to take both sides as partners.
Okay, sorry, can I have one more question, a short one?
Go on.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to know, what do you think, in your opinion, if Eastern Central China will further cooperate with China, Central Eastern Europe, sorry, will further cooperate with China, whether it will make the situation in European Union like worse? I mean, you know what is Orban doing, we know what is happening in Poland, how they're like going against European Union unity, right? Not against, but they have some contradiction there. So what do you think, Chinese cooperation with East Europe will make it worse, or will not influence that much?
Orban and Kaczynski are special cases. I can imagine that after Orban, and he will be ruling Hungary for some more years, but then further or later a change will take place in Hungary. This is my strong opinion. Europe is interested on good relations with China, but is afraid to a certain extent of China. The fact that China is rising so quickly from the, I was the first time in my life in China in 1974. It was incredible how different this China of 74 was to today's China. I have no time to elaborate on this, but China has an incredible speed in its development, and therefore many Europeans are afraid from China. It is long ago when the word that it was a German emperor who created the word of the yellow danger, die gelbe Gefahr. But I think a reasonable European policy must be a policy which tries, as van der Leyen is obviously doing, to establish stable and reasonable relations to China, and to take into consideration that for Chinese policy, stability is a great, great value. I think Chinese politicians are more interested on stability than many other politicians or countries in the world. And we should use this fact that China is interested on stability to create stable and trustful relations between Europe and China. And China also has to contribute to this stability in its actions, in its policy, in respecting European rules and rule of law, etc. But the goal must be stable relations, and this is the case for whole Europe, and is not only a policy for individual European countries, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you, Lord.
Thank you. So we should be also coming with the questions closer to Europe, but we have two questions from Jeddah. One is coming from the Islamic Development Bank, and the other one is coming, I think, from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So I don't know if Sarah is with us. It's a lady from OIC that wanted to put the question. Are
Hello?
you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, please.
Okay. Hello, Your Excellency and everyone. This is Farah Dahi. I'm an officer with the Secretary Cabinet from Organization of Islamic Cooperation. My question as follows, very simple. How is the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict is affecting the EU and the NATO, especially after the intervention of Turkey? This is the first question. And the second question is this is a possible threat to the EU stability due to the alliance and the intervention of other member states and other organizations? Thank you for your time.
The second question I did not understand.
Is the conflict is a possible threat to the EU?
The first question you put was on the Bergkarabakh issue and the conflict between Armenia and Armenia.
Both of them are on the. Both of them are on the same issue. Both of the questions.
Well, the strange situation of Bergkarabakh is a heritage of the structure of the Soviet Union, because Armenian people and Armenian culture and Azeri people and Azeri culture have many differences. They are not near to each other. They are separated through many facts. But in the Soviet Union, the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan was made in such a way that on the territory of Azerbaijan, there was an area under control of Armenia. And if you were visiting Azerbaijan, it was their main political concern to get back the territory of Berg-Karabakh, which was in the Azeri territory, but the people who lived there were Armenians. On the Armenian side, they, with all force, wanted to keep that area because the population was Armenian. And in the Soviet time, the power of Moscow was big enough to control this conflict and to keep the situation stable. When the Soviet Union collapsed, this wound was opened, and the conflict was always hard on the edge of a hot war, of a real shooting war. And now the weakness of the Armenian leadership in the last years and the bad economic situation in Armenia was a reason why Azerbaijan took the risk, supported by Turkey, to solve the conflict on a military way. I think the European Union has no right and has no intention to play a big role in this conflict. This is out of our area, out of our territory. The leading nations in that connections are Turkey on the one side and Russia on the other side. And it is obvious that now Russia was accepting the steps set by Azerbaijan, and I cannot imagine that there is a solution that how Armenia could get back the control on this area of Berg-Karabakh. Azerbaijan made a fait accompli. They had the stronger military forces, and I have no proposal for other solution or for going back to the status quo ante. This is my opinion.
Thank you so much. So I think it would be fair to switch to give the opportunity to students also to put the question. So I think we have a Konate, a student of UMEF, who is very keen on putting question to President Fischer. So please come up with a question.
Thank you, sir. Morning, Your Excellency, Mr. President Fischer. Thank you for your speech. So I am Chole Madhukonate, General Secretary of the Geneva International Network, a network of diplomats, bankers, and scholars. So, Mr. President, the coronavirus pandemic has tested really the resilience capacity of a lot of civilizations, states, and of course, us as individuals. At the European level, we saw a lot of dissent between frugal states and Mediterranean states on the EU recovery plan. For now and in the near future, Europe is going to face a lot of challenges: the answer to the pandemic, Brexit this weekend, geopolitical and political pressures from the United States and China, challenges such as migration, as you mentioned, terrorism, climate change, the advent of populism and nationalism. So on the classic review towards the European Union, one of the classic review towards the European Union is to summarize it as a liberal union and a market. So do you believe in the capacity of resilience of the European Union? And do you believe that Europe as a united geopolitical power, it's realistic and possible? Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes, I believe that. And you rightly enumerated a lot of heavy problems, the pandemic and the migration and terror and international problems, etc. But these are not only problems from Europe. the pandemic problem is a worldwide problem. The terrorism is a worldwide problem. The competition and certain antagonism between United States and China is a problem that touches the whole world, and the climate dangers, the warming of the atmosphere is also. I believe that these are important questions, but the European Union is in a situation to tackle these problems and to handle them and to find solution that is better than in many other parts of the world. Africa, with its fast growing of the population, is under additional pressure to overcome its economic and social problems. Look at Latin America. If I compare the situation of the European Union or of Europe with other parts of our global world, we have big problems, but the problems are also manageable, and I have a basically optimistic approach for the future as I tried to describe it. Also, I'm not satisfied with the level of democracy, and I'm not satisfied with the growing nationalism in some parts of Europe. I don't overlook these dangers or these weak points, but in general, the European Union is a marvelous construction. That's my answer.
Thank you, sir.
Very good. So one more question from UMEF fellows, just to balance, because we had two questions from outside, so to say. Please. I see that there are several questions coming from UMEF, but who is the first? First come, first serve, please. Yes.
Hello, Mr. Heinz Fischer. Very good morning, and thank you for your valuable time and your valuable speech, sir. It has been great. Let me introduce myself. My name is Aravind. I'm a student of JEX École de Management from France and also from Swiss UMEF Genève. I have a question for you, sir. How do you see the future of Europe right now and the current mistakes of global leaders in Europe on the way of handling the situation? And how do you see the post-COVID pandemic situation, sir? Thank you.
Well, of course, I tried to at least partly give an answer already in my presentation and present some strong points of the European Union and some weaker points of the European Union. The pandemic still has and had and still has a terrific strong impact on Europe, and the figures are alarming how big the amount of money is to overcome the problems created by the pandemic. But on the other hand, in my opinion, and I'm not an expert in medicine and in this field of sciences, but I could imagine that the year 2021 will be the year where, through vaccination and other achievements, the number of infections is significantly going down, and the infection is really medically under control. And that would mean that then a period will start of, let's say, 6 years or 8 years, which is needed to overcome the economic negative impact of the pandemic. This will not be done in 1 year, not in 2 years. It will need a similar time than the recovering from the financial crisis of the year 2008. And it means in reality 5, 6, 7 years to compensate the economic problems. And then some elements of our society will change. The phenomenon of homework, for instance, the phenomenon of replacing long journeys by video conferences like we have it now. This and other elements will be in a remarkable way influence the society of the year 2030, for instance. But the active era that of the pandemic influencing our daily life from a medical point of view could come to an end until the end of next year. And the economic impact is a longer one. I tried to describe it. And the societal impact will be partly positive and partly negative. And this will be the long-term consequence. That's my naive expectation.
Thank you, sir. But do you have some tips like how you can lead for leaders and upcoming leaders? Like how to proceed with the post-pandemic and with the future in Europe?
Well, I have the same observations as everyone, how different countries, if I look at the United States, if I look at Europe, if I look at China, how different countries react on the pandemic. It is necessary to win the trust of the people. It is necessary to demonstrate that in fighting against the pandemic, that it's not a question of party ideologies. This is not a question of entrepreneurs and the labor people or the elderly and the youngest. It's a problem for the whole population. A government, a leader needs good experts. He needs to be able to listen to the scientific advice he gets, and he needs the trust of the people that he as a leader or she as a leader or the whole team of leading people has the true will to save the population, to minimize the risk for the health of the population. And that a fair balance in carrying the burden is the goal of the leaders. If this precondition is existing, then you have a good chance to take the steps which are advised and recommended by people who have scientific knowledge how to fight against the pandemic. In Austria, by chance, the leader of the Social Democratic Party is a lady. Her name is Randy Wagner, and she was in earlier times one of the leading experts and scientists in medical research against virus and pandemics. And that helps her at the moment, and her advice is, so to say, very valuable, even for the government. Also, she is a leader of the opposition. But the Austrian government tries, similar to Mrs. Merkel in Germany, to listen to scientific institutions to get the best advice. And then they have the political responsibility to transfer the advice into political and economic reality. So that's how I see it.
Thank you so much. So Development Bank, I think we have questions from there. Please.
Good afternoon, Professor Anis. Good afternoon, Excellency, and good afternoon, honorable participants of this dialogue. My name is Nejad Ajanovic. I am speaking from Jeddah, but not speaking on behalf of the institution that I work for, which is Islamic Development Bank. I'm speaking to you as a concerned Bosnian citizen solely on this issue. And I would like to just in a few seconds sort of indicate to you a problem that we are having in Bosnia. It's to do with basically a bridge that is being built by the European taxpayers. And this particular bridge is in the amount of approximately $500 million US. So this bridge costs a lot of money to European taxpayers, including yourself, Excellency, which will de facto make almost a wall for Bosnia. And it will make Bosnia a landlocked country. And Bosnia, as you may recall, driving on the Adriatic, has approximately 24 kilometers of the coast. So there is enormous opportunities for Bosnia to become a proper maritime state. And we all know what it means in terms of shipment and in terms of trade to have access to the sea. So this is not, you know, a complaint, but it's just an appeal to all the good people in European Union to do consider this problem of ours in Bosnia, so that in the future Bosnia doesn't become a landlocked country, and that some type of goodwill is pushed towards these two friendly neighbors between Bosnia and Croatia, so that amicable solution is found, perhaps some type of corridor, a free corridor that would be given to Bosnia to access the open sea, while at the same time, Croatia could still go ahead with connecting its territories. So this is more of, let's say, a concern that I'm having personally as a citizen of Bosnia, somebody who has lived overseas for most of his life. And I take, you know, this opportunity also to you as an influential person in Europe, because we are not getting the right signals from the top echelons of European politics. And unfortunately, you know, Bosnia is going through difficulties. Certain nationalistic parties are in a way, you know, doing more in favor of the neighbors than for their own country and for their own interests. So sometimes within Bosnia, it is difficult to come to some type of, you know, unified voice. But I think as a EU is supernatural sort of organization, it should really respect the international law when it comes to UNCLOS, United Nations Law of the Sea, and other international agreements where both Croatia and Bosnia are signatories, and these countries are both successors of Yugoslavia, who has been very influential in the international sort of, you know, international laws and things like that. So somehow to be engaged and simply not to put Bosnia into more difficult situation as it has been, you know, since the war in the 90s. So thank you very much. And I kindly, you know, maybe ask you for your sort of reaction, and I would be happy. I'm a good colleague and a friend of Professor Anis, and I could leave him my contact details, and also the work of the people in Bosnia that are concerned about this issue, particularly the Maritime Association of Bosnia, which is a civil society organization and NGO that is being in contact with European Union. That's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I know Bosnia quite well. I think I have been 15 times in Bosnia. The first time was a Congress of Savez Studenata Yugoslavia 50 years ago. So I know the problem. I understand your concern. But frankly speaking, I hope that Bosnia, besides this particular problem of maritime rights and developments, Bosnia must make its homework in domestic policy. the split in these different groups and the split between parties and the lack of political stability, this is, in my opinion, the main problem of Bosnia. And I very much hope that the political leaders in Bosnia, Dodik is a very stubborn person, in my opinion, that the political leaders of Bosnia will reach progress and will demonstrate that they can speak with one voice, and then they can put the national interest of Bosnia on the top of their priorities. And then in the dialogue with Europe, the situation is prepared to get partnership with Europe to solve this problem you particularly mentioned. But this is not one of the problems, and maybe it's not even the biggest one. The biggest one is the political unity for Bosnia and the common political future. And then the dialogue will start, and then you can bring such problems in this dialogue with Europe as a whole, and then you will find the ears and the attention of Europe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So do we have a question from Afghanistan or from Geneva? Who is the next one?
Sure, yeah, I'll go ahead and dive in. First of all, thank you very much, President Fischer, for providing us your insights and wisdom. Since we all live in an interdependent world, as we can see, and you alluded to this on COVID-19 pandemic, I wonder if someday we can sort of aim to move toward the spirit of united countries of the world. Perhaps that's somewhat unreachable goal right now for us, but I wanted to have your insight regarding what should be the role of international organizations like the United Nations, for example, the World Bank, in terms of moving us all toward this united countries of the world, as opposed to just being the United Nations or United States of Europe or United States of America or United States of Asia. So to counterbalance this power or domination of one or two countries, let's say as superpowers, what do you think should be the role of international organizations like United Nations or World Bank in the future? So I look forward to hearing your insights.
Well, I'm thankful for this question, because I tried to explain and to describe in my introduction that the United Nations was a product of the situation and of the climate after World War II, because the predecessor of the United Nations, the so-called Völkerbund, the association of peoples in the 20s and in the 30s of the last century, was a disappointment, and it didn't work. And one country after the other left the Völkerbund. Hitler German was the first who left, and many others followed. After World War II, the United Nations was a great step ahead. And I'm an ardent supporter of the United Nations. I in particular appreciate the Human Rights Declaration from 1948, saying all human beings are born equal in rights and human dignity, and they should meet each other in the spirit of brotherhood. It's a wonderful text. And Ban Ki-moon and even Kofi Annan were good friends of mine, and Ban Ki-moon still is a good friend. We founded the Ban Ki-moon Center in Vienna and in South Korea. And I can be very concrete. I ask you, take the Sustainable Development Goals, take this document about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and you have really a good program for international cooperation. It took 5 years in the United States to reach agreement on the SDGs. They were adopted in September 1915. I was in New York at that time. I voted for Austria in favor of the SDGs. I gave my little speech of 5 minutes or so. It was very limited, of course, but I tried to introduce at all opportunities I have to say, why not concentrate more on the SDGs? If you are interested in a united global policy, if you say we need cooperation not only in Europe or cooperation in the Far East or cooperation in Latin America, we need a global cooperation. Then the Sustainable Development Goals touching the questions of international cooperation, touching the question of climate protection, touching the question of gender balance, touching the cooperation in the field of fight against poverty. This is my, so to say, my ideal. This is my recommendation to use the instrument of the SDGs for a global, common, coordinated policy. And I'm happy that you put the question, and then that I have the opportunity to make to express my respect for the SDGs as an instrument for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to mention that I am from Dunya University of Afghanistan in Swiss UMEF campus in Kabul. So my thanks go to you, and obviously Professor Anis as well, for organizing this session. And the SDGs are actually being implemented in various universities in Afghanistan right now. So we're thankful. I did watch your 5-minute presentation actually when you presented that. So thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Excellent. So we had, I think, Robert from Spain that was having nearly same question. So since we are running a little bit out of time, basically we will move to the further question which comes from UMEF. It's Mr. Arber, if I'm not mistaken. So please, floor is yours. Be brief on question.
Thank you, Your Excellency, dear colleagues. I'm Arber from Illyria College in Pristina, Kosovo, partner institution of Swiss UMEF University. So it's been 20 years now since the last war in the Balkans ended. The last one was in Kosovo in 1999. And the people of Western Balkans being devastated by all these events, the only hope we see and have seen is the integration into the European Union. We are very aware and appreciate your personal efforts and support for Kosovo and the region. My question is, how do you foresee the integration process of the Western Balkans with regards to membership to the European Union? And what are the most significant obstacles and dangers that you consider might jeopardize this process? Being the European Union member countries not willing to accept further enlargement, Western Balkan countries not working hard enough towards this process, or any other factors? Thank you, Your Excellency.
I always was arguing that the European Union is not complete until the countries of the Western Balkans are also part of the European Union. This is my strong conviction, and I know that many politicians, and I'm not a politician anymore, I'm a retired president or politician, that the present generation of leaders in Europe has, with few exceptions, the same position. The great problem, in my opinion, is that the enlargement from 15 to 27, as I described it, obviously was slowing down and reducing the capacity of the European Union for decision making. It is a very, very simple story that in the group of 6, you easier come to results, to common results in a group with 12. In a group with 12, you have it easier than in a group with 27. and to enlarge the European Union further under the present conditions. Many European parliaments, for instance, will have reservations. So what, in my opinion, would be the strongest help for the enlargement of the Western Balkan countries would be a successful conference of the European Union, as von der Leyen has proposed it, which is reducing the number of decisions where unanimity is necessary. We need a change in the structure of the European Union. We need a possibility that the next step of enlargement, which is valuable and deserved and necessary, is matched or is combined with a change in the structure of the European Union to make the decision process easier and to enlarge the number of majority voting possibilities. This is the biggest obstacle, and this is the instrument how to overcome the obstacle. Then Europe will be happy to include the Western Balkans, because the countries of the Western Balkans belong to Europe politically, economically, and cultural, and from the history, from every sense, from every side we look at it. The Western Balkan is a part of Europe, but the European Union should avoid to be a union with a number where decision-making becomes almost impossible. That's my belief, my opinion.
Thank you.
We are getting closer to an end. Maybe 1-2 questions more.
May I ask my question, please?
Yes, please.
Thank
you. Go ahead.
Hi, Mr. President. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Fiona Comlan, President of the Geneva International Network. My question is very simple, very clear. What are your views on the advent of nationalism and populism in your own country? Thank you.
Well, very direct question and a very good question. Of course, I'm often thinking about that. The two founding parties in Austria, the Christian Democrats, called the People's Party, and the Social Democrats, were by far and definitely not nationalistic parties. On the contrary, their existence was, the main reason of existence was to fight against nationalism and against the ideology in the time of Hitler, Germany, etc. This is the starting point. It is true that in Europe as a whole, nationalism was growing in the last, let's say, 20 years. And Austria is not an exemption. And the party, which is, they called herself Freedom Party, which is, so to say, coming from the nationalistic ideology, was having 5% of the votes for many years, for many decades, 5, 6, 7%. And then they were growing beyond 25%. And it was a symbol that nationalism was gaining influence. And nationalism is often combined with populism. It's not only nationalist parties which tend to be populistic. This is a temptation for every party, populistic approach for vote getting. But this combination of nationalism and populism was growing in Austria, in particular at the end of the last century and at the very beginning. And the symbol for that was the center-right government, which took power in Austria in February 2000. and lasted until 2006. In 2006, this government was eliminated by the voting result, and the coalition between Social Democrats and Conservatives were established again. Then a second phase came some years ago where it was a center-right government. At the moment, we have a government from a conservative party with a Green party. This is a new combination. It never existed before in Austria. It is in office since 1 year. It's a combination of conservative and Green party. They have in parliament about 55% of the seats. And the Nationalist Party, the Social Democratic Party, and the Liberal Party are, so to say, the opposition in our parliament. And it is our duty to advocate for political pluralism, to distribute power in a fair way under every control of our constitution, but together fight as good as we can against stronger standing of nationalism, as it is the case in Germany, as it is the case in France, as it is the case in Italy and in many other European countries. Austria is not an exemption. But as I said, at the moment, the constellation is such that the most nationalistic politicians are in opposition. And I'm thankful that you put this question to say a few words on the political structure in Austria at the moment. Our democracy is stable, but nationalism and opportunism, populism is a problem. And it is not a small problem, but we overcome it.
Excellency, with your permission, maybe one more question before we close. I see that we keep you, so I know that you have some other commitments.
I appreciate to discuss with you because my next term is the dentist, and I'm much more like to discuss here than to go afterwards to the dentist.
Yeah, because Jessica told me that you have some other appointments later. You are so kind. Okay, we have nearly similar questions that are coming from two different parts of the world. One is coming from my distinguished colleague from Indonesia, the largest and the eldest Indonesian university, which is called University of Indonesia of Jakarta. There is even the bus line within the university. It's a huge compound. And the question is actually now, when the time of the global realignment is coming, when the confrontation between China and the United States is coming, how do you see ASEAN? Because ASEAN will be on a fault line. And ASEAN was having many similarities with the EU. And the other question comes from Rio de Janeiro, from Brazil. And it's nearly similar. So what is the role of the BRICS? What would be your take? So they are nearly similar questions, as I said, two parts of the world.
If I look at the history of the 20th century, long time the great powers were standing for them alone. Germany, United States, Russia, China, strong countries in Latin America, alliances were almost not existing, at least not in a way as it is existing now. And of course, the United States were also an alliance from different states, but that cannot be compared. This was a special development on the northern part of the American continent. And the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, was the time when such alliances were founded. And for me, the best example and the example I know best is, of course, the process of European integration. And we talked about it, and I said the things I have to contribute and I have to to say from my position as far as Europe is concerned. But with this European background, I believe that alliances and groups of countries in other parts of the world are also reasonable. I studied on the spot the African Union. The African Union, with its seat in the north of Africa, is by far not so deep as the European Union, but it's a good instrument for Africa to coordinate African interests and to give to some question a coordinated African answer. And the same is the case in Asia, and it is a very recent development that China and many other Asian countries organized economic cooperation, and it will be valuable for the Asian countries, and they negotiated long for this result, and they reached a success, and I think it's positive. And the same is the case in other parts of the world. If a group of countries is able to organize a union or a coordination system, it is a contribution to stability. It is in a certain amount a contribution to peace and to peaceful cooperation, and it is a chance for a stronger economic coordination. And therefore, I don't know an example where such a way of coordinating and cooperation between a group of nations who are geographically near to each other, that is a disadvantage. On the contrary, it's always good if you reach regional groups, and it makes peace and economic cooperation more stable, in my opinion.
Very good, thank you. So maybe 1-2 questions more, not to overstate with the president, please. I know Professor Venkovska was indicating question on the recent, let's say, cleavages and the troubles between Bulgaria and Macedonia. But I don't know if she's here. Aha, Ambassador. Ambassador, are you here?
صوتي راح مرة ثانية.
Yes, please.
غريبة. وين مور؟
ايه مور؟
Hello.
disconnect
I think that
لما يجيني تليفون لما يجيني تليفون.
Someone got by mistake, I think, the microphone.
Okay.
Anyway, so maybe if we are not having right now a question, so what is your take on this conflict between on this, let's say, the frictions between Bulgaria and Macedonia and the apparent blockage of Bulgaria?
Well, the situation in Southeast Europe, and in particular on the Balkan, as we know from history, we have a heritage of many conflicts. And if we spoke before about the enlargement of the European Union, I believe that one of the advantages of this enlargement process would be that these conflicts would come under control and would be eliminated. As the conflict between Slovenia and Croatia, for instance, and Serbia is under control through the fact that Slovenia and Croatia, at least, are members of the European Union. The conflict, as far as Macedonia is concerned, first of all, for us, was a conflict between Macedonia and Greece. And this seemed to be very complicated, but finally, the nationalists on both sides were kicked back, and a constructive solution was found. Macedonia changed its name in Northern Macedonia, and Athens and Greece were convinced that there is no danger for so to say, territory expansion from one or the other side. So I believe the situation between Greece and Northern Macedonia is now settled and stable. And the conflict between Northern Macedonia and Bulgaria in the same way must be settled, and I'm optimistic that the nationalistic heritage will be overcome in the relations between Northern Macedonia and Bulgaria in the same way as it could be overcome and solved in the relation between Northern Macedonia and Greece. And by the way, the government of Northern Macedonia, which is now in office, in my private opinion, is much more flexible or reasonable and interested on solutions than the former government in Northern Macedonia. There is a change of the governments in Macedonia, which probably made the solution possible. And therefore, I believe that this new government of Macedonia, they are in office since 2 years or so, that they also will be able to overcome the conflict with Bulgaria. I don't think that this is a problem which will be an obstacle for enlargement which cannot be solved. It can be solved, and it will be solved, and it will be stabilized and secured after the enlargement took place.
Thank you, Excellency, so much. I think we should be slowly closing for today. It was a great honor to have you. There are so many questions still unanswered, you know, so if you follow the dialogue blog, you know, so you will see that it simply burns. And this is actually a clear indication that we should be inviting you soon again, and hopefully physically also to come to UMEF. I know that you've been so many times to Geneva. Yes. The UMEF University has recently moved from the center. They had very handy premises in the very center of the city, but now they moved to the lovely premises that you simply instantly fall in love. This is very nice chateau, which is overseeing the River Rhone. And on behalf of our president of university, Dr. Giles Sandel, we are cordially inviting you physically to come to premises for socializing, but also for lecture and also for relaxation as well, because it's really lovely. The talk will be, yes, the talk will be posted also on the website. I was just indicating it's www.umef-university.ch. And this would be a last lecture for this year. We are expecting the former Prime Minister of Ireland to be the next guest, sometimes in January. We are still working on a date. It will be John Bruton. Of course, after the Brexit, it will be very interesting to get the let's say, the Irish take on the entire situation and to get to the other corner. And previous guest, as you know, was let's say, the rock and roll star of the new economy, Professor Varoufakis, which was also a very good speaker. So we placed President Fischer in a very nice center.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good Christmas and stay healthy and have a good year. And thank you for your invitation and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Best wishes.
We think differently.